Hi, this is National Master Dan Heisman, and this is my series for YouTube of helping people get better at chess. My plan for my series of videos will include a lot of amateur games. The reason I include amateur games is that most of the people watching the video are amateurs, and you want to see what people are doing, why they do it, how you can avoid it, and how you can take advantage of it. It's a good idea to study a lot of master games because then you see what's right, but it's also good to see what not to do and what to do against it. So I think studying mostly master games makes sense, but studying no amateur games makes no sense to me at all. So since everybody else is doing master games, I thought I would feature in our YouTube series a bunch of amateur games. So if you have an amateur game, please send it to me at danheisman@comcast.net. I think the email associated with my channel is actually the Gmail email, which I don't use. So don't click on that. It's danheisman@comcast.net, or you can go to my website, danheisman.com, and just click on the picture of the envelope, which is the icon for emailing. So today I'm going to do an amateur game. And this game is going to be the Immortal Quiescence game. So before we start the game, I want to define what a quiescence error is. I believe quiescence error was coined by Grandmaster Krogius in his book Chess Psychology, but I could be wrong about that. But a quiescence error is one where you analyze the position and then you stop because you think the position is quiet, when in fact you have to keep going. Now, what does quiet mean? Well, quiet in chess usually means there's no further checks, captures, or threats that would change your possible evaluation of the position. If they are, then you need to keep going in your analysis before you can evaluate the position. So let's start with a really simple example before we get to the game. This is a position where almost no one would make a quiescence error. It's white to play. And if you were a beginner of beginners, you might say, well, how many checks do I have? And the answer is, I only have one, queen to e8 check. But that's no good because he can take my queen with a rook. And rooks are worth less than queens, so even if I get his rook back, then I'm losing my queen. But if you would stop here, that would be a very trivial quiescence error. I think almost everybody watching the video understands that this is what we would call a pseudo-sacrifice. Yes, you're losing your queen, but you get it all back on the next move when you checkmate him. So, of course, to stop after queen e8 check and say I can't do that because he'll take my queen is not correct. Rook takes, checkmate. All right, well, that's really easy, but I watch, I've been teaching amateurs one-on-one for, over, I hate to say it, like 50 years, but certainly professionally for the last, 23 years or so. That's my full-time job, is teaching chess. And I see quiescence errors all the time. Amateur players say, well, I don't want to take that piece because when he takes me back, I lose material. And I go, yeah, but on the next move, you're winning. And they go, yeah, I didn't see that. I just stopped. So in puzzles, people don't stop. In puzzles, people see that, there's got to be an answer, so I got to keep going. So if this was a white to play and win puzzle, they would never miss this. And in fact, if this was not a puzzle, this was a game, they still wouldn't miss it because their tactical vision would tell them, oh, this is an easy tactic. I don't have to worry about losing my queen because I'm checkmating him. But in a real game, sometimes you have to give up a little bit of material to get a lot more on the next few moves. And if you stop after the first move or two and say, I'm not getting anything, then you're going to miss it. So I have a game one of my students played, and later in the game, he makes a series of quiescence errors. So I call this the Immortal Quiescence Error Game. Let's pull up the game. All right. He was white. He played e4. This was a slow game. I think it says 45-45, but this is not time-stamped. I think this might have been like an over-the-board game or something. All right, so his opponent played Sicilian. White played knight f3. Black played d6. White played bishop b5 check. That's the Moscow variation. Okay. Black plays bishop d7. Bishop takes d7 check. You could take either way here. A little bit more normal is to take with the queen because the knight's reasonable square is to go to c6. All right, so queen takes, castles, knight f6, rook e1 guarding the e-pawn. e5. All right, but if black plays e5, white can still get d4 in by simply playing c3 first and then d4, and that's a very reasonable thing to do here. White just decides to play d3, but it's going to become a little difficult for white to get space. Right now his break moves, his pawn breaks, are d4 and f4, and if he's not going to play c3 and d4, playing f4 is going to be, you know, a little bit of problematic here. So he's got to play one of those two ideas in order to get space for his pieces. It's always a good idea to know about break moves. Okay, so black plays bishop e7. White just develops the knight to c3. As I said, I would have played c3 and d4. Knight c6. So we're seeing here, in a sense, we're learning about amateur mistakes. So white's making a little bit of an amateur mistake in that by not playing for his break moves, his pieces are going to get very static here. There's the non-pawns in the position for white are not going to have a lot of things to do if the pawns are not going to help break open the position. All right, so bishop to g5. So white has a minor positional threat here to remove the guard on the d5 square and stick the knight on d5 in the near future. Black says, you can do that right now if you want. White says, okay, I'll do that. And now if black wants, he can not let his king side get open by moving the bishop, and then he could challenge the knight with knight to e7. So that's what he does. And white here could still play for the break moves with like c3 and d4 if he wants. Turn on the analysis below. And in fact, I've turned on Stockfish 10. You can't see it in the video, but Stockfish 10 agrees that playing c3 here is the right idea. And white does it very good. So he plays c3, and white has a nice little advantage now. Black plays the little bit of a strange move queen there. I'm not sure why he didn't want to play knight e7 right away. He certainly could have. Stockfish said the best move was to play a6. All right, so queen e6. Now the bishop's kind of stuck guarding c7. White plays queen to c2. Probably queen to b3 was better. And black plays his break move, f5. Very good, black. The problem is, of course, that white has a good position, and the black queen is hanging here. So the white queen can go to b3, and then there's some threats to play knight check in those positions. All right, so white does play queen to b3, and now black has to watch out for tactics. Stockfish suggests black should play rook to f7. He plays queen f7, which also stops the tactics. And white plays c4, but that weakens his d4 square. That's not such a great idea. Now what black can do, since this diagonal is closed, is he can open up the f-file for his rook, move the queen out of the way, and threaten to play rook takes f3 and open up the king. So that move c4 is an anti-positional move. It kind of ruins what white was doing. The computer suggests the best move here was something like either a3 or h3 or something like that, like a3. All right, so c4, now black's better. f4, well, f4 allows black to play g5, g4, and then open up the king side, but it's easier just to take the pawn right away and get this pressure on the f-file. So f takes e4 was a little better. All right, white brings the queen back. I guess he's worried about these pawns being pushed, but not sure how queen d1 is going to help him that much. And black logically follows up with g5. A lot of my students go, oh, I don't want to push those pawns in front of my king, make my king weak. But actually here, white's pieces can't get the black's king at all now based on the pawn structure. And black can just push those pawns up and open up the white king. So black absolutely has the right idea here. Stockfish wants white to play h3. And h3 is a tough move to play because you don't like to weaken the pawns in front of your king when he's doing a pawn storm. In this particular case, playing h3 and then knight h2 gives you a pawn, a knight, and a queen to hold the f4, the g4 square. But it's still dangerous to do that, even though the computer says it's about as good as you got. The computer says that white plays perfectly, maybe black's a little better. And black's certainly easier to play here. Even though white has the best minor piece on the board, black's pawns on the king side are way more dangerous than anything white's doing. All right, so white moves the knight to d2 to try to hold that diagonal with the queen. We'll draw that line there. And black plays h5, trying to play g4 and then break open the king side with g3 or f3, depending on what happens after that. White plays h3 now. Here the computer thinks black should play bishop to a5, maybe getting rid of this defender of the white squares. Black plays queen g6, getting another piece onto the g4 square, so that g4 is now safe. So black's in control here. White's got to play some good defense. White plays f3, trying to hold up that g4 break. Black plays king f7. He wants to put the rook on that diagonal. He realizes the center is completely locked now, so his king on f7 will be okay. White tries to get his king out of the line of fire, king h1. Black plays rook to h8, so that when he plays g4, if white ever takes and black takes back, this h-pawn will be pinned. White says, oops, I better get back to the g-file. That's the lesser of the two evils. But already black is in good shape. How should black continue here? Again, the computer suggests bishop to a5 first, then get the rook over to g8, and then bad things are going to happen to white. Black instead plays the unusual move queen to h6, which really doesn't make his queen better. You know, even if he can get the queen down to h1, that's not mate. So the queen was actually doing a better job supporting g4 when he was on g6. So that's not a good move by black. White plays rook to b1. Why is he playing there? Because he wants to break with b4 and open up the queen side. So now white's doing what he should have been doing in the opening. He's playing to open up the lines for his pieces to counterattack. And up to now, he's been completely outplayed by black. But let's see what happens. So black plays bishop a5, which was the best move a couple moves ago. In this position, it's still okay. It hinders white from playing b4, which, by the way, is still his best move. But a couple moves ago, it was pretty much winning. So white moves the rook out of the way so the knight won't be pinned in case he wants to move the knight. Here, black should just take that knight right off the board. By the way, this position is fairly locked, fairly closed, so knights are better than bishops in this kind of position. So just on general principles, bishop takes d2 is probably not a bad move. All right, black tucks his king in the middle on e6, but now white should blast open the queen side. Now he's only got two pieces guarding the b4 square, but the problem is the bishop can't really take because the knight can fork on c7. So it turns out that b4 is probably not only safe, but it's white's best move here. White instead blocks his break move with knight b3, which is not a great idea. Now it's going to be obviously tougher to play b4. Black should just put his bishop on b6. He would be certainly very, very happy if white traded off his wonderful knight for that not-so-good bishop. Black says, you can take my bishop on a5. I'm going to bring my rook into the attack. But the problem with that is that now when white takes the bishop on a5 and black takes back, white can break and hit the pawn and the knight at the same time, and black will be forced to open up the lines on the queen side, and then white will start to make inroads toward blasting open the middle toward getting to black's king. So white sees that, and he plays the correct idea. Knight takes a5, knight takes e5, queen a4. Not the right way to do it. Again, engine says b4 by far the best. And it says if white plays b4, white's much better by about a pawn. If white plays queen a4 and black just plays knight c6, then black's better by almost 2 pawns. So that's a pretty big mistake. Black does play knight c6. And white does play b4. He had nothing better. It just was stronger when he was attacking the pawn and the knight, forcing open the lines. And now black has to play very carefully because white has some dangerous things coming up, and we're going to start to see about the quiescence errors very soon. So black should play queen to g7 with a nice advantage according to the engine. He plays queen h7. Looks like almost the same idea, but believe it or not, it makes a giant difference. Instead of black being ahead by a pawn or two, it has white ahead, and now white should open up lines. He takes the pawn. That's one of the reasons why black moved his queen over here to guard the b7. And black takes back, and white plays queen to b5, threatening. Queen takes c5. Okay, black plays rook to g7 and says, go ahead and take my pawn. That's a mistake, but he's got to be careful. He can't put the queen on e7 to guard the pawn. He can't play b6 because it's guarding the knight. And if he plays king to d6, white can just simply play queen takes b7. So black decides the least evil is to guard the pawn with the rook and give him the c5 pawn. The engine actually says that queen d7 is the best move, but black understandably plays rook g7. I'm sure I wouldn't have found queen d7 either. So white plays queen takes c5, and black says, let's break it open. So finally, he's going to play his break move on g4. And now white can break through and he's completely winning. But he starts to make a series of quiescence errors. So here, this is basically kind of a white to play and win position. All right, what does white play and what should he have played? Well, white tries to keep the position closed by playing h4, which is somewhat understandable, and it gives white a good game. But what he should play is rook takes b7. See, this is where the quiescence errors come in, and there's a whole series now. White said to himself, oh, if I play rook takes b7, I'm losing a rook for a pawn. Rooks are worth 5, pawns are worth 1. I can't do that. But all you have to do is look at the next sequence of couple moves, and you realize that this is massively good. If white plays rook takes b7, and black happens to play rook takes b7, then white's only reasonable move, queen takes c6 check, is winning immediately. The black king cannot come up to the 5th rank. He can't interpose, which means he has to go to f7. And now, even if white doesn't see anything else better, queen takes rook check, and he's just won a rook, a knight, and a pawn for his investment of a rook. And not only that, if he wants, he could just trade queens and go into an endgame up a knight and a couple pawns. So rook takes b7 is not a very difficult move. This is, again, called a pseudo-sacrifice. You're not really sacrificing a rook. All you have to do is look further. If he takes the rook, you win the house. Rook takes, check, king here, check. You know, computer says it's mate in 11, but you don't have to see that. That doesn't matter. So rook takes b7, missing rook takes b7 is a quiescence error, and it's a very easy quiescence error because the lines after it are all forced and extremely easy. You just have to not stop. You have to say, if I play rook takes b7 and he plays rook takes b7, are there more checks, captures, or threats that are worth investigating? And the answer is, of course. Queen takes c. Even if you didn't even see you were winning the rook, if you just saw that rook takes, queen takes, knight check, now you're getting a knight and a pawn for your rook, which is not much less, plus you've exposed his king, and your queen and your knight are checking the king around the board. Well, even if you weren't winning the rook, this would probably be more than enough. Yet white told me after the game, he said, you know, I just thought rook takes pawn was no good because he's got it covered. So he really didn't analyze past. He just kind of hand waved the first move and said, all right, well, I can't take the pawn. It's guarded by that rook and the queen. So instead, white plays h4. So black says, let's open up the line against your king. Let's see what I can do. Too bad his queen's not on that line. Would be a whole different ball game here. All right, and now it's white's turn. What can white do? Well, the natural move is to recapture rook takes f3. But actually, white has another sacrifice here that he could play. He could play, well, besides, he can't play, he could play rook takes b7. The problem now is after rook takes g2 check, king h1, queen takes b7, guards the knight. So rook takes b7 doesn't work. But white has a different move that he could play. He could play this check. Knight takes f4 check. And again, if you stop and you just say, oh, I can't do that. He'll take my knight with a pawn and I'll lose a knight. Let's see what would happen if he did that. Pawn takes, queen checks. If the king goes to the back to the 7th rank, rook takes pawn check is going to win again. But if the king goes to f6, white can check with the queen. Now the only legal move is king f7, and now we get rook takes b7 check again. He can't put the knight in the way because you just take it. And now the knight's hanging, and now all of a sudden, black is not only losing the knight, but he lost all those pawns and his king is exposed. And the computer says white's up by 16 pawns with best play here. So here, for the second move in a row, white misses a pseudo-sacrifice. Now this is a lot harder than rook takes b7, but it's not a move that a strong player would, you know, if Gary Kasparov played knight takes f4 check, I'm not sure he would give himself an exclamation point. You know, it's not that hard for a top player to play moves like this. It's not even at my level. I'm going to look at knight takes f4. It's a check, and it gives me line clearance to get my queen in here, and that kind of line clearance could be winning the game. So you have to investigate that. All right, so white plays rook takes f3, and white has a good game. He doesn't need to be too risky here. I'm just trying to point out that white, white again is saying, oh, I can't make these moves. They're not safe, but actually they are. All right, so black says, oh, let's double my rooks and attack this pawn. Well, again, here we go. Knight takes f4 check. Now it's even better because the rook can take on f4 later. And if he takes the knight, queen d5 check, where is he going to go? Let's say he tries to go king f7, king e7. Then we've got our rook b7 check again. If he ever goes to the f file, I can play rook takes f4 check. Let's say he doesn't go to the f file. Where else can he go? Really not much of anywhere. If he goes to e8, queen takes c6 check. If rook to d7, queen c8 check. And this game is getting to be toast. Rook d8, queen e6 check, king f8, rook takes f4 check. There's that other rook in there, and yeah, obviously it's going to be mate. All right, so back to the game. So white can win with a series of checks here. He doesn't need to guard g2. But again, white thinks, oh, if I play knight takes f4 check, I'm just losing a knight for a pawn. So he brings his rook back and he guards the pawn on g2. And again, this is reasonable. He is winning. Earlier, he missed some things that would have given black the better game. Here, the good news is, even though he keeps missing things for quiescence errors, he doesn't have a bad game. So black plays rook to g4, and the knight takes f4 check still works, even though the rook is guarding it. But I'm sure most people would say, oh, now that he's guarding that pawn again, it's even less likely to work. But here, knight takes f4 check. It doesn't matter if he takes with the rook. We still have queen d5 check. If he plays king f6, queen d6 check. And now bad things have to happen. King g7, rook takes b7 check. If rook f7, he just takes it off. What can he do? King h8, rook h7 check. We just won the queen. The knight's hanging. If white wants, he can just stop and take off the knight, winning easily. All right, so he's getting all those open lines for the checks. So instead, white plays rook on f to b2, and that does throw away the win. The engine says now if black plays perfectly and triples on that g2 pawn, black can get a draw. So this time, not playing making the quiescence error has cost him the advantage. Black, on the other hand, thinks he needs to play defense, and he plays rook back. But now white can take the pawn again, because if black takes with the queen, he wins the queen, and if black takes with the rook, then queen takes c6 check wins. So again, rook takes b7 is going to win the game. White plays the strange move knight to b4. All right, so again, let's look at it. Rook takes b7. If queen takes b7, then rook takes b7, rook takes b7, queen takes c6 check wins. If rook takes b7, rook takes b7, then queen takes check, and no matter where the king goes, then rook takes b7 check and wins. So again, not too hard. All you have to do is figure that next check. All right, so white plays knight b4. Well, that does clear out d5 for the queen. So it still gives white a good position, but he's missing all these breakthrough moves. So black takes, white takes with the rook, and black brings the queen into the defensive area to stop queen d5 check. And now the engine suggests white should just play queen takes a7. White says, let's trade queens. But here white's only up a pawn, and he has the black king on the run. And you want to trade when you're winning, but if you got the opponent's king open in the middle of the board and you can win more material, then trading only up a pawn goes from being a really, really good middle game to a much more difficult end game. All right, so queen takes, pawn takes. I think we're done with most of the quiescence errors. King d6, rook takes b7, rook takes b7. So white certainly has a good game. Black plays f3, trying to get one of these pawns back. White tries to guard g2. Black takes. White could have, of course, just gone after the other pawn and given him that pawn. Rook takes. Rook takes h4. Rook checks. King back. Rook checks. King d6. Rook takes a7. Rook hits the d3 pawn. White should just may as well guard that pawn now and then get the king into the game. He checks first, and black goes back. Black should probably try to get his king into the action. He's probably worried about this passed pawn, so he plays defense instead. White goes behind black's passed pawn, but that abandons his pawn, so this pawn's really not going anywhere with the king in the area. So it's better just to guard this pawn, then get out of the way, then you could push the a pawn. The rook on c3 would block the king out of the game. So rook a3 is kind of the right idea here. Rook h3, rook takes d3, rook takes h5, king d6, rook checks, king back, rook to e6, rook checks, king up, rook checks, king e3, rook takes, rook takes. So this is a theoretical one endgame. Rook and connected pawns in the middle versus rook. You just have to make sure you don't stalemate him or move your pawns in such a way that he could win one pawn. You want to keep the pawns together and bring the king up. Rook checks, king f4 is logical. Rook back. You want to move your rook as far away as possible. It's just a good general principle in these positions. Keep it away from the skewers and stuff. Rook checks, king e5. Rook there. Now I would play like rook h5 and rook checks. You can play rook checks right away first. He does. All right, now move your rook as far away as possible. Rook a7 is a good idea. Okay, good move. Rook there. Now you can move the king and push the pawns. He pushes that pawn first. Well, that doesn't throw away the win. I think I would play king f5 first. If he checks, then I can triangulate up and push the pawns. d6. Rook over. Now again, king d5 followed by e5, e6, end of ball game. Instead, he plays that strange, terrible move. This pawn here cannot be guarded by the king, and it cannot be guarded by the pawn. So white is violating the principle to keep the pawns together. I guess he heard another principle, which was passed pawns must be pushed, but you don't push them up to where you're going to lose them. So black plays there, which is good enough. And now white can't simultaneously avoid the checks and guard his pawn. He plays king to d4. Black skewers him. Now black has to make sure not to take the pawn into a losing king and pawn endgame. King there. So now rook takes d7 is a terrible blunder due to rook takes d7, king takes d7, king f6 winning. But if black doesn't take the pawn, he should be able to draw. So he correctly plays rook h2. Very good, black. Not an amateur move. White realizes he can't get the pawn up. He's trying desperately to do so. Black checks. White goes out of the way. Black says, which pawn do you want to guard? White says, I'll guard that one. Now we have a theoretical kind of Philidor kind of draw. King takes d7. Rook checks. King blocks the pawn. Easy draw. Rook b5. Rook back. King attacks the pawn. And now the rook attacks the pawn again. And white doesn't even wait for black to make his move rook to b4. They agree to a draw. All right, so I call this the Immortal Quiescence game. And it was an interesting game, and you can learn a lot from the Immortal Quiescence game. No, that's a different game. This is the Immortal. I was memory there. The Immortal Quiescence Error game. This is the Immortal Quiescence Error game with 5 or 6 moves in a row where white makes quiescence errors. You don't see that too often. Okay, so for next time, we will come back with another video. Hope you enjoyed our amateur game. If you have an amateur game, just you don't have to annotate the game. Just send me the moves in an email at danheisman@comcast.net. Thanks. Bye.